Honestly, I still think about that laminated sign on the Poolgate comic, sans taped down like it was evidence taped to a murder board, 400 layers of packing tape trying to make misdemeanor into manifesto, and how Gary Hutchkins treated it like a coronation. The man put more care into that sign than most people put into retirement plans, and I respected the craftsmanship even as I was quietly planning his public humiliation. That right there is where this story begins, with a sheet of paper and a man who decided rules were a god to worship rather than a tool to use responsibly. I moved into Sycamore Ridge about 2 years before any of this went down. Nice little HOA community clubhouse, unused tennis court, a modest gym, and the pool, which for a guy who works from home and lives alone was basically my social life. June through September. First year was fine. Paid dues, mowed the lawn to regulation height, waved at neighbors, kept off the list of people who paint shutters neon without permission. Then Gary got elected board president. Gary had been treasurer before, quiet with numbers. Once he had the gavel, he went full store manager on a Sunday crowd. Sudden authority, sudden taste for enforcement. Polo shirts tucked into khaki shorts, tan Camry in the driveway. A wife named Linda, who'd clearly learned early to live in a different room from her husband. That's Gary in a nutshell. He started small, a paper sign-in binder beside the Poolgate name unit, time, number of guests, signature, laminated instructions in Comic Sans, 6 bullet points, 2 of which threatened suspension pending board review. Then he started patrolling the pool in his polo, not swimming, just auditing cushions, confiscating imaginary contraband. Once he lectured an 8-year-old about the illegal status of her hot pink pool noodle as though she'd smuggled fireworks. I kept to myself mornings under the shade, structure book in hand, signed the log, scanned my fob model, HOA citizen, by all practical measures. Then one late June Saturday, about 14 months into Gary's reign, my friend Darius, who doesn't even live here, just comes by, sometimes came over. I had noted his name in the guest column when I signed in because that's the rule. Gary materialized an hour later, binder in arm, and asked to verify our guest registration. He stared at the log and at Darius and said, "The entry says D. Williams. I need a full legal name for guest registration." You could feel the oxygen leave the scene, like someone had turned down the world's volume to a very annoying frequency. I told him to write Darius next to the D. He said I couldn't amend logs because it would compromise integrity. Then he wrote something and left. 2 weeks later, laminated sign on the gate. Pool access revoked, Unit 14B. No letter, no hearing, no vote, just a sign taped like a verdict. If you know HOA law, and I didn't at the time, you'd know due process for suspending amenity access is specific written notice opportunity to be heard, a board vote at a noticed meeting. None of that happened. I dug in. I reread our CC&Rs like someone reading the fine print on a scam email. Then I pulled the state-planned community statute, the one that outranks the CC&Rs in a lot of ways. And it said access suspensions needed 14 days written notice, a specification of the rule violated evidence, and a right to a hearing. The statute also said unlawful suspensions were void and unenforceable, and the board could be liable for actual damages. That paragraph felt like a life preserver thrown into a raging pool. I sent certified letters, emails, invoked procedures, requested the hearing I was due. Management remembered my note faster than the board. Rhonda from the management company was polite. Said she'd look into it, and then notable, the certified mail return receipt was signed by Gary himself. 10 business days came and went with silence. On day 12, I followed up. Then Gary sent me a 3-page underlined heavy letter accusing me of fraudulent guest registration. Fraudulent was underlined 3 times. It was what you get when someone confuses indignation with legal training. I paid for 1 hour with Patricia, a real estate attorney who smelled of paperwork and calm. She read the letters, the CC&Rs, the statute, and she said flat that my reading was correct. The suspension looked defective. The pool conduct code Gary cited might not even be enforceable if it hadn't been properly adopted. And if I wanted to press it, there was reason to seek damages for denial of a paid amenity. She was also honest the fight would cost time and money, and courts don't always cheer for small procedural victories. But she said something that reframed everything. The issue isn't whether you violated a pool rule. The issue is whether the board has the authority to suspend you without process. If they didn't follow the process, the suspension doesn't legally exist. That phrasing "doesn't legally exist" sat with me for a while. Meanwhile, I pulled the recorded plat for the community, partly out of curiosity, partly to see if any common areas might be usable if the pool squabble dragged on. The plat looked like a child's model with lots and shaded common parcels. And then I saw Gary's lot had a 20-foot drainage and utility easement across the front, recorded in the 1980s, reserved to the Sycamore Ridge Community Association for common use for all purposes, consistent with community operations and member activities. That phrase "community access" kept ringing in my head. If the easement covered Gary's front lawn strip, and if community activities included social gatherings, then hypothetically members had a right to be there. Deb, my neighbor who works in commercial real estate and absolutely cannot stand Gary for reasons unrelated to me, was immediately in on the idea. I told her what I'd found. She laughed, asked what I'd do with it. I told her I wanted a pool party on Gary's front lawn. She said, "Define pool party." I said, "Rent a roll-off dumpster, line it with heavy-duty tarps, fill it with water, put chairs around it, and have people over." She hung up on me, laughing, but then called back to say she'd bring a cooler. I asked the attorney if I was insane. She smiled and said she'd seen stranger remedies and that the easement language might cover a community social event as long as we didn't damage property or block drainage. She warned me it would look provocative. I said that was the point. We prepped like we were staging a benign act of civil disobedience: dumpster rental, heavy-duty tarps, binder, clips, a water plan with Marcus from down the street who loved the idea and brought a water drum and a pickup truck, inflatable flamingos, because of course steel drum playlist, croquet, Walt insisted, and a folder with the easement document highlighted and printed for the police. We even did the polite thing: I sent certified notice to the HOA and a courtesy note to Gary, outlining that I'd be using the recorded easement for a community social event Saturday noon to 6, citing the recording book and page, promising no permanent fixtures and no damage. Friday, the dumpster arrived, placed precisely within the easement boundary I'd marked with landscape paint. Gary stood on his porch, watched the placement, went through confusion to comprehension to fury, and then shut his door like the curtain had fallen on a one-man melodrama. Saturday noon, we had 11 people in and around the dumpster, neighbors and friends. Steel drums playing half-inflated flamingos, providing circus energy. The cops even stopped by. I handed them the easement recording and summary, and they shrugged and told us to keep the noise reasonable. Gary came outside multiple times, filmed a little, argued that it was a zoning violation without citing a code section, then retreated to his house, and once left a handwritten, passive-aggressive note, slipped under my door, calling me a source of friction and suggesting maybe Sycamore Ridge wasn't the right fit for me. I photographed it, added it to my file, and continued being civil, which is to say I waved like a calm person who'd just legally dunked a man's pride in a rented dumpster. After the party, Rhonda emailed asking if I'd been present and asked for an explanation. I replied with the easement docs and the police interaction. Then I got a certified letter from Gary's attorney accusing me of nuisance trespass and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The tort claim read like an attempt to convert embarrassment into a legal club. Patricia laughed politely and then sent a crisp response asking for legal basis and saying the recorded easement was a complete defense. 3 weeks of back and forth, some bluster, a dropped trespass claim, and finally a quiet withdrawal. No apology, no admission, just a concession that the hot air had deflated. My pool access was restored in writing. The pool conduct code quietly disappeared from the HOA's posted rules a couple months later. Gary is still president. Nobody wants that job. But he learned something in the way you learn things when you find yourself filmed standing on your porch while your neighbors splash in a dumpster. He never spoke to me again beyond a stiff nod, and I give a pleasant wave when we pass on the road. The pool is great. Summers are ordinary and wonderful again. If there's a moral here, it's not a lecture. It's a quiet, worn truth that landed on me like a warm hand on a shoulder the day I read the plat. People who wield power by intimidation are often the most insecure about holding it. Real authority doesn't need to be performed with laminating machines and underlined threats. It rests in knowing your documents, your limits, and your obligations, in wielding power with humility, instead of spectacle. Gary thought a laminated sign, a personally managed binder, and a dramatized letter would be power. Real power, I found, was a recorded plat and the patience to read it. And maybe the other lesson is simpler and slightly petty, which I admit I embrace. If someone takes something from you because they enjoy doing so, give them back the experience of having it taken in a way they'll remember, legally, civilly, and with steel drums. Justice in our little corner of the world came not from a courtroom verdict, but from neighbors showing up, the law in hand, and a ridiculous amount of preparedness. So tell me, have you ever seen someone take authority too far and get schooled by community paperwork? Drop your story below. I want to hear about your own karmic dumpster moments, or the time a thin rule finally met a thicker reality. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of petty power, what did you do about it? Share, argue, commiserate. I'll be reading. And hey, don't forget to sign your guest log with your full name next time.
Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video.